45% of the cooking oil in the United States comes from Canada, and most Americans have never once read the ingredient list. 25% is the tariff that landed on Canadian canola on April 2, 2025. 80% is the share of American canola oil that Canada supplies to the United States every single year. $11 billion is the value of canola oil and meal the United States received from Canadian farms in 2024 alone. $29 billion is what canola contributes to the Canadian economy, supporting 207,000 jobs in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta. The country that sits on top of the oil controls the oil. This is not a tariff dispute. This is geography, agriculture, and a quite $30 billion dependency Washington forgot existed because Americans eat the oil without knowing where it came from. And the man standing at the press conference refusing to blink is Mark Carney, Prime Minister of Canada, former Bank of Canada Governor, former Bank of England Governor, the only G7 leader with a 40-page central bank crisis playbook memorized by heart. What he did next exposed exactly how little leverage Washington thought it had when it tariffed a vegetable. I'm Mike Carter. This is the decision room where we break down the geopolitical, military, and economic decisions that shape the world. No filler, no spin, just the story told straight. In the spring of 1972, in a low-brick laboratory at the Agriculture Canada Research Station in Saskatoon, a plant breeder named Thief Danny walked into a room full of skeptical farmers and announced that he had spent 11 years quietly breeding a new version of rapeseed, that yellow-flowered European cousin of mustard and cabbage, into something that could actually be eaten. The problem with rapeseed is orotic acid, a fatty compound that builds up in Discover More Language Learning app language translation service writers resources animal hearts when the oil is consumed in volume. By 1970, after more than a decade of crossbreeding, Canadian agronomists had reduced the orotic acid content below 2% of the fatty acid profile, well below the level any regulator considered safe for human consumption. The seed was a Canadian invention. The science was Canadian. The brand had to sound Canadian. So, the board of directors of the Rapeseed Association of Canada, sitting in a downtown Winnipeg meeting room in 1973, voted on a name. CAM for Canada, OL for oil, A for low acid. Canola, Canadian oil low acid. The word was trademarked in 1978, transferred to the Western Canadian Oilseed Crushers Association, and by 1980, the marketing body was renamed the Canola Council of Canada, headquartered in Winnipeg. The plants that became the crop that became the commodity that became the dependency did not exist 30 years earlier. It is a pure Canadian invention, stamped with the country's name on the front of every bottle sold in every American supermarket today. The asset at the center of this story is not iron, not lithium, not semiconductors, not a rare earth mineral buried in a half-continent away. It is a yellow flower grown on the prairies above the 49ª parallel, crushed in plants in Yorkton, Lethbridge, and Clevet, and shipped south by railcar and pipeline to processors in Bakersfield, Great Falls, and Stockton. Canada crushes roughly 15 million tons of canola seed every year. About 4.9 million tons of the oil extracted from those seeds flow south across the border into the United States. In 2024 alone, Canadian canola seed oil and meal exports to the United States were valued at $7.7 billion by Steps Canada and the Western Grain Research Foundation. The Canola Council of Canada reports a slightly higher figure when canola oil routed through third-country transshipment is included, closer to $11.2 billion a year in canola oil and meal flowing into American refineries, food plants, and renewable diesel facilities. The Canola Council's own industry statistics put the total Canadian crop value at CAD $12.6 billion in 2024, of which the United States is the single largest buyer at $5.7 billion Canadian dollars in seed alone. 80% of all canola oil consumed in the United States, cooking oil on grocery shelves, fire oil in fast food restaurants. The feedstock pumped into renewable diesel plants from California to Montana comes from Canadian prairie farms. That shit rose from somewhere between 50 and 60% before 2020 to 91% by 2023, according to the United States Department of Agriculture's Foreign Agricultural Service in a report titled U.S. Renewable Diesel Production Growth Drastically Impacts Global Feedstock Trade. The shift happened in 3 years. The shift happened because American biofuel policy, specifically the Environmental Protection Agency's Renewable Fuel Standard Pathway approvals in 2022 and 2023, classified canola-derived renewable diesel as an approved advanced biofuel eligible for biomass-based diesel renewable identification numbers. Between 2021 and 2024, U.S. renewable diesel production capacity expanded by approximately 5 billion gallons of annualized nameplate. That expansion required feedstock, and canola oil from the prairies north of the line was the feedstock American refineries were built to consume. There is no American substitute at scale. The Pacific Northwest plant in Great Falls, Montana, built by Montana Renewables and Phillips 66, is configured to accept Canadian canola oil contracts as its primary input. The Marathon Refinery in Dickinson, North Dakota, the Diamond Green Diesel Facility in Norco, Louisiana, the World Energy Plant in Paramount, California, each built in the post-2021 clean fuel expansion cycle, accepts Canadian canola oil as a primary, in some cases dominant, feedstock. Replacing it with domestic soybean oil requires physical reconfiguration of hydrotreater piping, resecuring of supply through expanded soybean crush capacity, currently 2.8 to 3.1 billion bushels annualized according to USDA Economic Research Service, and a multi-year permitting cycle at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for new feedstock pathway approvals on a per-plant basis. This is not a tariff. This is a pipeline. Now we walk the decision sequence because the sequence matters, and because the language Trump used in January, February, March, and April of 2025 is precisely the language the architects of his trade strategy chose to use, and the words they did not use reveal what they thought they were buying. On January 20th, 2025, Donald Trump took the oath of office for his second term as President of the United States and inherited an existing tariff schedule. Within 7 days, on January 27th, he called Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and announced that the United States would impose a 25% tariff on all Canadian imports under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, citing what the White House described as an inadequate flow of migrants and fentanyl across the northern border. Trudeau was in his last week as Liberal leader. Mark Carney won the leadership on March 9, 2025 and was sworn in as Prime Minister on March 14. On February 1, 2025, the United States imposed its first wave of 10% tariffs on Canadian energy and potash and a separate 25% tariff on all other Canadian goods with execution delayed a month. On March 4, 2025, Canada implemented 25% retaliatory tariffs on over $20 billion of U.S. goods. On March 13, the tariffs took effect on both sides. On April 2, 2025, the formal announcement landed on canola specifically, a 25% tariff on Canadian-grown canola and canola products, the first time since the Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement of 1989 that this particular crop had been targeted by name. By mid-March, Trump's team was floating an additional 35% levy on top of the 25%, a doubling of the burden that would have priced Canadian canola oil out of every American food shelf and renewable diesel tank. That threat was suspended in late April under the existing Canada-United States-Mexico agreement review process, but the 25% baseline remained. On August 14, 2025, 12 days after a Canadian federal election cycle closed, the government of China's Ministry of Commerce imposed a separate and simultaneous set of barriers on the same Canadian crop, a preliminary 75.8% anti-dumping duty on Canadian canola seed layered on top of 100% tariffs on Canadian canola oil and meal imposed earlier in March 2025 in retaliation for Canada's 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. Canada was being squeezed on both ends. The Carney government responded on September 5, 2025 with $370 million in new production incentives for canola farmers, expanded trade access into Asia, and a quiet but explicit policy redirect. Carney announced that Canada would not pursue a free trade agreement with the United States at this time while pursuing deeper integration with the People's Republic of China. In January 2026, Carney and Chinese leadership announced the largest reset of bilateral trade relations in a decade, with the Canadian annual electric vehicle quota rising to 49,000 units and canola seed tariffs collapsing from the 75.8% peak down to a combined 15% weight by March 1, 2026. Trump responded on January 24, 2026 by publicly threatening to impose an additional 100% tariff on all Canadian imports if Ottawa proceeded with the China reset. The strategic miscalculation. This is where the script earns its runtime. The architects of the April 2025 tariff package believed that Canada was a captive market that had nowhere else to send 15 million tons of seed every year. They believed the United States consumed so much of the crop that Canadian farmers and processors had no alternative demand. That is the leverage theory underlying the White House strategy. The assumption was that since U.S. renewable diesel plants were configured to accept canola oil and American food manufacturers had reformulated their labels around canola oil, Canada would negotiate. The assumption was wrong on a scale that by 2026 became impossible to ignore. The 25% tariff on canola did not stop the flow from north to south. It redirected Canadian canola into Chinese and Asian markets via Vancouver, Prince Rupert, and new bulk handling infrastructure in the port of Thunder Bay. The same crop that Trump's tariff was punishing was purchased by the very adversary the tariff was supposed to weaken America's position against. The 25% tariff did not weaken Canadian leverage. It created a price wedge that China, an oilseed deficit nation, exploited by purchasing 100% of available Canadian canola at a discount. The Trump strategy did not levy a tariff on Canada. It levied a tariff on America's own renewable diesel industry, America's own food supply chain, and America's own food price index. The same canola oil that American refineries need to meet their renewable volume obligations under the EPA's RFS2 program was being drawn away from American buyers into a buyer with fewer renewable diesel refineries, no feedstock pathway constraints, and the explicit political will to absorb Canada's surplus. The strategic assumption collapsed in the same way a thesis in a Harvard economics paper can collapse when a single piece of counter-evidence refuses to disappear. Mark Carney, asked on the AP Newswire in August 2025 whether Canada's posture was bluffing, said, in the kind of line you do not introduce unless you intend to retire it, that Trump's tariff threats are bluster, and what comes after them is what matters. And what comes after them was the export ledger. Professor Daniel Ailey. McCarthy, chair of the Sasson School of Management Center for Energy, Finance, and Macroeconomics at Chulalongkorn University, and one of North America's leading analysts on agricultural trade retaliation, summarized the asymmetry in a December 2025 submission to the Atlantic Council. When the consumer country imposes a tariff on the input it cannot replace, the tariff is a tax on its own future. Canada can sell its canola anywhere. The United States cannot buy equivalent canola oil anywhere in the required quantity without rebuilding the supply chain it tore down in 1996. That last phrase is the payoff line. The 1996 reference is to the conclusion of the United States-Canada Free Trade Agreement's tariff phase-out on oilseeds, the moment ran few years earlier when American soybean farmers and processors knew they had lost the feed oil war to Canada and accepted it. Washington's 2025 tariff resurrected the pre-1996 framework without realizing that the framework itself was the leverage it was handing back to Ottawa. Now, the scope of the leverage. Read this paragraph slowly. Canadian canola is grown on roughly 20 million acres of prairie cropland in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta, a footprint that has expanded by 4.7 million acres since 2017. Canadian canola oil is the single largest source of imported cooking oil in the United States. 80% of total U.S. canola consumption comes from north of the border. Canadian canola feedstock supplies an estimated 40 to 50% of the renewable diesel feedstock inflow into U.S. renewable diesel plants in 2024, according to commodity analysts at SAP Global Commodity Insights and at Stillwater Associates in their November 2024 analysis of feedstock policy on U.S. renewable fuels production. In dollar terms, Canada exported 3.3 million metric tons of canola oil worth approximately $4.8 billion to the United States in 2024. Plus 3.8 million metric tons of canola meal worth roughly $2 billion or more, and roughly 1.2 million metric tons of canola seed direct from Canadian prairie farms. Together, that is the $7.7 billion figure already cited, and the $11.2 billion figure when canola oil routed through alternative logistics configurations is added. The canola industry supports 207,000 Canadian jobs, contributes $29.9 billion annually to the Canadian economy, and pays over $11 billion a year in wages to workers in Vancouver, Saskatoon, Lethbridge, and the prairie towns most Americans have never visited. Canada is the world's #1 exporter of canola seed, oil, and meal. The #2 country, Australia, produces roughly a fifth of Canada's volume and is constrained by climate, water, and land use competition with wheat and sheep. American domestic canola cross capacity in 2024 was at the time approximately 2.4 million metric tons per year. is small enough that a sudden decimation of Canadian imports would blow a hole in the U.S. renewable diesel program, roughly equivalent to 1.2 billion pounds of missing feedstock oil in the first 12 months. There is no domestic American substitute at scale. Soybean oil was already diverted into U.S. renewable diesel plants, according to the same SAIP global numbers, with the U.S. soybean crush having expanded by roughly 30% in 2024. But the additional volume needed to replace Canadian canola, even with the new crush capacity coming online at roughly 620,000 bushels per day in North America as of mid-2025, still requires 3 to 5 crop cycles, 5 to 7 years, of expanded soybean acres to fill the gap. Weather, the planting cycle, and pipeline reconfigurations at U.S. renewable diesel facilities cannot be retooled by an executive order. The oil comes from the north, and the country above the line controls the oil. That is not politics, that is geography, the domino chain. If you have been watching this channel for the last 14 weeks, and I want to acknowledge that for the regulars here, this run of videos is one continuous story. This is the 8th domino. Domino 1. A 25% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum signed in the spring intended to revive American primary smelting and to send a signal to Ottawa. Domino 2. A 10% tariff on Canadian energy, softwood lumber, and potash floated in early spring designed to test Canada's economic floor. Domino 3. A renewed bilateral fight over softwood lumber duties culminating in an August 2025 preliminary countervailing duty against U.S. softwood producers, Canada's quiet countermove. Domino 4. The dairy tariff hike of 2025 aimed at Canada's supply-managed cheese and butter industry fought by Ontario and Quebec at the provincial level. Domino 5. The digital services tax fight where Canada paused implementation in deference to Cosmo renegotiation tops only to be hit by an auto tariff. Domino 6. A 25% tariff on Canadian automobiles built in Oshawa and Brampton on the rationale of national security under Section 232. Domino 7. The threat to annex Canada and make it the 51st state floated as a rhetorical device through 2025 and used as the political backdrop for every subsequent tariff announcement. And now, Domino 8, Canola. And Canola, ladies and gentlemen, is different. The first 7 dominoes were about manufactured goods, supply-managed quotas, tariff lines on the harmonized tariff schedule, and rhetoric. The numbers in those fights were in the hundreds of millions, perhaps low single-digit billions. Canola is owns to $12 billion a year of U.S. dependency written into the formulas of American food, American renewable diesel, and American soybean substitute policy for 8 years. The first 7 were spreadsheets. This is a pipeline. The previous tariff threats were cancelable by executive action. This one cannot be unwound without the physical replacement feedstock taking 3 to 7 crop years to grow. You cannot replace a flour with a tariff negotiation. You cannot rebuild a 30-year agricultural supply infrastructure with a press conference statement. You cannot renegotiate from weakness the thing you cancelled from assumed strength. Scenario 1. Probability I am placing at 25%. The United States and Canada conclude a partial tariff rollback by the autumn of 2026 with canola restored to duty-free status under a renewed Section B of the Cosmo Review and the renewable diesel feedstock flow restored to its pre-tariff trajectory. I am placing this at 25% because nothing in the pattern of either Washington or Ottawa suggests a willingness to fold the canola card voluntarily. Scenario 2. Probability I am placing at 55%, the most likely outcome. Trump maintains the 25% tariff as a bargaining instrument into the 2026 U.S. midterm cycle. Canola continues to be redirected to China. The United States absorbs higher renewable diesel feedstock costs, and food manufacturers reformulate around soybean and palm slowly over a 5 to 7 year window while Canadian canola crush expands through new facilities in Regina and at a multi-billion-dollar upgraded Cargill crush site at Camrose. Carney holds the line. Scenario 3. Probability 20%, rapture. Trump follows through on the January 2026 100% threat. Canadian retaliation escalates substantially on potash and lumber, and the renewable diesel industry enters crisis mode feedstock rationing by mid-2027. Mid-2027 with RIN values spiking and biofuel compliance deficits forcing the EPA to delay or restructure annual percentage volume obligations. I label this 20% because nothing in Carney's pattern or Trudeau's pattern in 2018 when Canada held firm on steel and aluminum and forced a partial rollback within 11 months suggests Ottawa will fold. Prime Minister Carney is not a protester. A is not a politician making speeches at rallies. He is a former Goldman Sachs banker, a former Bank of Canada governor, and a former Bank of England governor. The only person who sat inside two of the world's most consequential central banks during two global crises. He knows what monetary leverage looks like. He knows what balance sheet leverage looks like. He knows what trade balance leverage looks like. And what he did quietly between September 2025 and January 2026 is hand the most reliable buyer of Canadian canola to the rival America wanted to contain. The hidden reality is that Washington, by tarifying a Canadian crop that America itself depends on, did not stop the oil. It relocated it. Beat. And here is the tell, the most telling thing of all. Trump has not mentioned canola in any of his 2026 press conferences, not once. Not the way he has mentioned steel, not the way he has mentioned automobiles and aluminum. There is a reason. To name canola is to name the structural problem he is quietly hoping Canada does not press. To say the word out loud is to admit that the United States has, by executive fiat, priced a staple cooking oil out of every kitchen, a renewable diesel feedstock out of every biofuel plant, and a billion-pound freight flow out of every farm belt rail terminal in dos estates. It does not say the word because the moment he says it, the question the press will ask is whether the United States of America can cook dinner without Canadian prairie oil, and the honest answer is no. The decisions are being made. We will see you when the next one happens.